Picture a young man who came from a family that had produced doctors for over 100 years, a boy who was supposed to wear a white coat and carry a stethoscope, but instead ended up in front of television cameras as one of the most loved cowboys of the early 70s. Picture a car crash that changed his brain forever and quietly rewrote his personality for the rest of his life. Now picture this. The very same studio that employed him got their cameras rolling again just 12 hours after he died. They pulled his replacement straight off an airplane and put that man into the dead actor's own costume the next morning like nothing had happened. And decades later, a filmmaker named Quentin Tarantino looked back at this forgotten actor's old footage and used his heartbreaking life as inspiration for one of Leonardo DiCaprio's most praised performances. This is the story of Pete Duel, a man who fought against Hollywood, fought against his own mind, and in the end lost both fights on the very last night of 1971. But before we get to the gunshot, before the Christmas tree, before the telegram that he shot a hole through, there are 10 key moments that shaped this man and led him toward his tragic end. And strangely enough, his story doesn't start in Hollywood at all. It starts in a place nobody would expect a future television outlaw to come from. He was born Peter Duel on February 24th, 1940, in Rochester, New York, the oldest child of a doctor named Ellsworth and a nurse named Lillian who had Swedish roots. His family lived in a peaceful little town called Penfield, and their house doubled as his father's medical clinic. His grandfather had been a physician, S.E. Ho had his great-grandfather. A couple of his cousins would go on to become doctors too. Medicine ran through his bloodline for more than 100 years, and everyone assumed young Peter would simply continue the family tradition. But behind his striking blue eyes, this boy was dreaming of something completely different. By the time he was only 5 years old, he could already recognize military planes just by looking at their shapes in the sky. He didn't want a waiting room full of patients. He wanted wings. He wanted the sky. At 17, he marched into an Air Force recruitment office fully ready to sign up and fly. But the recruiter checked his eyesight, saw it wasn't good enough, and turned him away. His dream of flying ended before it even started. So that same year, he enrolled at St. Lawrence University, the same school his father had attended, planning to study medicine like everyone expected. But sitting through chemistry lectures wasn't where his heart was. He belonged on a stage, not in a lab. He joined the university's theater group and took the lead in a Tennessee Williams play. And he performed with such fire and honesty that his own father, the man who had always wanted a doctor for a son, sat in the audience and, after watching him, gave him permission to walk away from medicine and chase acting instead. That single night on a college stage completely changed the direction of a family legacy that had lasted generations. During Christmas break in 1957, Peter and a friend were driving through a snowstorm in upstate New York when their car crashed head-on into another vehicle. Peter was thrown through the windshield. His face was torn open by shattered glass, his tongue was almost cut through, and he was bleeding from a head injury. He stayed in the hospital for nearly a month while surgeons worked to repair the physical damage. But there was another kind of damage that no surgery could fix. The impact caused internal bleeding in his brain, and scar tissue formed in areas that would go on to trigger seizures for the rest of his life. At just 17 years old, Peter developed epilepsy. Doctors put him on 2 strong anti-seizure medications, which he struggled to tolerate and often took inconsistently for years afterward. And here's the part of this story that is almost impossible to ignore. One of those medications has since been connected by researchers to depression, unstable moods, and thoughts of suicide. It's possible that the very drug meant to protect his brain was slowly working against his mental health the whole time. He never spoke publicly about that crash, never used it as an excuse for anything, but the people closest to him noticed something had changed. The carefree, adventurous boy from Penfield had turned into a young man who smiled on the outside while carrying something much heavier underneath. Was it the epilepsy itself? Was it the medication? Or was it something buried inside him long before that windshield ever shattered? Around 1960, he packed up his belongings and moved to New York City with almost no money and no safety net. He rented a cheap room at the YMCA and cleaned bathrooms and hallways just to afford his stay. Every free hour he had went into training at a well-known acting school where he spent 2 exhausting years learning Shakespeare, classical comedy, fencing, dance, and movement. His first paying acting job finally came in 1962, a small part in an off-Broadway production in Greenwich Village, where he also worked backstage as an assistant stage manager because acting alone didn't pay enough to survive. After that, he joined the national touring cast of a Broadway comedy, and when that tour reached Los Angeles in 1963, he made a decision that would shape the rest of his career. He decided to stay in Los Angeles, but he privately gave himself a strict deadline. He told himself he would give Hollywood exactly 5 years to prove itself worthy of him. If nothing meaningful came of it by then, he planned to return to New York and to the kind of serious stage acting that actually felt real to him. He barely told anyone about this personal countdown, but it was already ticking in the back of his mind, and Hollywood had very different plans for how long it intended to keep him. His television career truly began in the fall of 1965, when a new sitcom introduced America to two future stars in a single frame. One of them would go on to become a household name, and Peter played her uptight, psychology-obsessed brother-in-law. He appeared in the majority of that show's episodes, and even though the material was light and fluffy, his natural charm shone through every scene he was in. The network canceled the show after just one season, but Peter had barely caught his breath before he was cast as the lead in a new romantic comedy about a pair of newlyweds living in a cramped apartment. He appeared in every single episode of that series. It earned strong reviews, and he was named one of the most promising young male stars of that year by a respected industry publication. But once again, after just one season, the network pulled the plug, and Peter publicly blamed the studio, claiming another producer had pushed him out of his time slot. By the middle of 1967, a major studio locked him into a long, exclusive 7-year contract. Guest appearances started piling up on some of the biggest shows on television. He made his big screen debut in a war film in 1968, starred in a comedy alongside a well-known leading man in 1969, and filmed a western overseas in Spain in 1970. On the surface, everything looked perfect. He was a rising star backed by a major studio, but behind closed doors, he was deeply unhappy. His personal 5-year deadline was approaching fast. Broadway felt further out of reach than ever, and the parts Hollywood kept handing him were exactly the shallow, forgettable roles he had originally left Los Angeles in his mind to escape. Was he actually climbing toward something meaningful, or was he simply climbing a ladder leaned against the wrong building entirely? In January of 1971, a new Western adventure series premiered on television, inspired heavily by a hit outlaw film from a couple of years earlier. The idea behind the show was simple but exciting. Two likable outlaws are secretly offered a full pardon by the state governor, but only if they can manage to stay completely out of trouble for an entire year while the rest of the world still believes they're dangerous wanted men. Peter was cast as the clever, silver-tongued half of the outlaw duo. A fellow contract actor who reminded studio executives of a young Paul Newman was cast as his partner. Their chemistry on screen felt completely natural from the very first scene. His co-star later described it as pure luck, saying they never once sat down and discussed how to play a scene together, that it just worked. Almost like a marriage, where two people never need to talk things through because they simply understand each other. The show became popular fast, especially among teenage girls who put his picture up on their bedroom walls, and fan magazines couldn't get enough coverage of him. But the timing was brutal. The show was up against some of the most dominant programs on television at the time, and it never managed to break into the top 30 most watched shows in the country. Peter took every disappointing rating personally, as if each one were a direct verdict on his own worth. He told a major newspaper near the end of 1971 something that would later read like a warning nobody caught in time. He said that being tied down to a series, any series, was a heavy burden for an actor who genuinely cared about his craft, that it slowly drained away anything artistic a person might have, and that it felt completely destructive to him. He added, with clear bitterness, that he was contractually stuck doing the show or something equally worthless. If he hated feeling trapped this badly, why couldn't he find any way to break free of it? Underneath all of this, Peter was struggling with alcohol, and not in the glamorous, harmless way that Hollywood often likes to portray. His drinking had already caused real harm to real people. In the fall of 1970, he caused a serious car accident in Hollywood that left 2 people injured, and he was arrested for driving under the influence and for leaving the scene. The hit-and-run charge was eventually dropped, but months later, in the summer of 1971, he pleaded guilty to drunk driving in court. The judge fined him heavily, suspended his sentence, and took away his driver's license. In a letter he wrote to that same court, he admitted something painfully honest, that he was searching hard for a meaningful life outside of his career. He promised the judge he would quit drinking. He even started attending recovery meetings, but the promise didn't hold for long. The depression that had followed him ever since that car accident back in 1957 was only getting worse. People around him started noticing dramatic mood swings. Some days he was full of energy, laughing, reciting Shakespeare at sunrise. Other days he barely said a word to anyone. One of his business associates once found him standing barefoot outside his own home at 4 a.m, reciting Hamlet in a loud, powerful voice as the sun came up, before suddenly shouting up at the sky that he loved his own son. A producer who worked closely with him noticed the same pattern, describing him as sometimes wildly upbeat and almost manic, and other times unusually intense and withdrawn. That producer said he always felt Peter took the world's problems personally, as though it were somehow his job to fix everything wrong with it, and that the weight of that belief was slowly crushing him. In the summer of 1971, he collapsed on set from complete exhaustion and had to be carried away by a studio ambulance. He was a passionate environmentalist who refused to use containers that couldn't be recycled. He was politically active, having campaigned for a presidential candidate back in 1968 and having personally witnessed police violence at a major political convention. He carried every cause, every injustice, every piece of bad news in the world like it was somehow his personal failure. How much longer could one person carry that much weight before something inside finally broke? Peter never married, though several women in his life tried hard to reach the person hiding behind his charm and humor. His co-star from that first sitcom adored him deeply, though she later admitted he treated her more like a little sister, which frustrated her because her feelings for him ran much deeper than that. His co-star from the romantic comedy series had a brief romance with him. He also dated an older actress who already had 2 children, whom he grew to love as though they were his own. But the relationship that came closest to saving him was with an actress he met while filming a movie in 1969. He genuinely wanted to marry her, and he was convinced she was the answer to everything he was searching for. Instead, she left him suddenly to marry another actor, a marriage that fell apart within just a couple of months. Peter was crushed. The tabloids treated the breakup like cheap gossip, and he felt publicly humiliated in front of an industry he already resented. His final relationship was with a young woman he met on the set of another show, an aspiring actress who quit her own job just to be with him and moved into his home in the Hollywood Hills. Peter later credited her with pulling him back from a depression so severe it had left him nearly afraid to leave the house. He once said that before meeting her, he had been a complete wreck, and that once she moved in with him, he finally started to feel like himself again for the first time in years. But even she couldn't stop what was coming. She could bring light back into his life, but she couldn't keep the darkness from creeping back in behind them. In November of 1971, Peter ran an independent campaign for a seat on the board of the Actors Union. He wasn't chasing status. He genuinely believed the union needed to fight harder for better conditions, for actors trapped in the grind of weekly television work. He threw himself into that campaign with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life, his causes, his politics, his craft. And he lost. A telegram arrived at his home informing him of the defeat. He read it carefully, and then something small caught his attention. The final sentence of the telegram was missing a period. He pinned the telegram to his living room wall, pulled out a loaded revolver, and fired a single bullet straight into it. Then he turned to the people in the room and joked that he had just added the missing punctuation and made his defeat official. Everyone laughed. It seemed like classic behavior from him. Dramatic, funny, a bit reckless, but ultimately harmless. Nobody stopped to ask an obvious question. Why did a devoted environmentalist who cried over disappearing forests and refused disposable cups even own a loaded gun in the first place? Nobody wanted to think too hard about the answer. That bullet hole in the wall would later become a key piece of evidence in the investigation into his death. But in November of 1971, to everyone around him, it was just another one of Peter's jokes. On Thursday, December 30th, 1971, Peter arrived on set in a genuinely good mood. People who worked with him that day later said he seemed cheerful, even lighthearted. His license was still suspended from his earlier DUI conviction, so a studio driver brought him home that evening to his rented 2-bedroom house in the Hollywood Hills. That night, with his girlfriend beside him, he sat down and watched an episode of his own show. He hated what he saw. He called it trash, using the exact same word he had used in that newspaper interview weeks earlier. Afterward, he switched over to a basketball game and started drinking. He drank heavily that night. His autopsy would later show an extremely high level of alcohol in his blood. At some point after his girlfriend had gone to sleep, Peter walked into the bedroom. He was undressed. He went to the dresser and picked up a small package. She thought at first it might be a forgotten Christmas gift. Inside was the same revolver he had fired into that telegram weeks before. He looked at the woman who had helped pull him out of the darkest period of his life and said just 5 words, "I'll see you later." Then he walked into the living room. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning on December 31st, 1971, she heard a sound like a firecracker going off. She found him beneath the Christmas tree, a wound at his temple, the bullet having passed all the way through and shattered the front window behind him. She called his brother first, and then she called the police. Peter Duel was 31 years old. His personal 5-year deadline had passed 6 years earlier. He never made it back to Broadway. He never escaped the trap he had spent years describing to anyone who would listen. And the very last thing he watched on television was a show he despised, wearing a smile that never reached whatever he was truly feeling inside. But what happened next proved that the entertainment industry's coldness didn't end with that single gunshot. Investigators who examined the scene noted the gun had been fired at extremely close range. At first, they suspected the possibility of foul play, since the weapon showed signs of being fired twice, but the second shot was quickly traced back to the telegram incident from weeks earlier. His girlfriend passed a polygraph test without issue. In the end, his death was officially ruled a probable suicide. The show's executive producer wanted to pause production out of basic respect. The network's response was blunt and unforgiving. According to several accounts, they told the studio there was no way production would stop, reminding them of their contractual obligation to deliver the show on schedule or face legal action. Incredibly, the entire cast and crew were back on set and filming again by 1 o'clock that same afternoon, barely 12 hours after Peter's body had been discovered beneath his own Christmas tree. The show's narrator, who had actually worked alongside Peter years earlier on an unrelated television movie, was on vacation with his wife when he got pulled directly off a departing airplane and told simply that Peter had shot himself and that he needed to come back immediately to take over the role. He flew straight back to Los Angeles. By the very next morning, he was being fitted into Peter's own costumes. By Monday, he was already filming Peter's scenes as the new lead. His co-star was devastated by the loss. A studio publicist later said the man was overcome with grief at the funeral home and couldn't even bring himself to attend the actual funeral. Months afterward, he told a tabloid exactly what he thought of how the studio had handled everything, saying that Peter's body was barely cold before an identical costume was already being fitted for his replacement, and that watching the studio erase any memory of Peter so quickly taught him the harshest lesson he would ever learn about how Hollywood really works. Peter had appeared in the majority of the show's episodes before his death, and his replacement took over for the remainder of the series. Audiences never fully accepted the switch. The show was canceled a little over a year later, finishing its run near the very bottom of the ratings. Think back now to that boy from Penfield who nearly followed generations of doctors into medicine. Think about the 5-year deadline he set for himself, the windshield that shattered his skull and possibly rewired his brain chemistry long before Hollywood ever got a real chance to break his spirit. Roughly 50 years after Peter Duel died beneath that Christmas tree, filmmaker Quentin Tarantino studied his old footage and recognized something the rest of the world had somehow overlooked. He saw the outline of a story about a struggling television actor drowning in self-doubt, quietly medicating a mood disorder nobody around him fully understood, watching his own performances on screen and hating what stared back at him. Tarantino later used elements of Peter's story as inspiration for the fictional aging television actor played by Leonardo DiCaprio in his acclaimed film set in 1960's Hollywood, a performance that earned enormous praise. In a strange twist of fate, the actor the industry had rushed to forget became the quiet inspiration behind one of the most celebrated films of that decade. His former co-star, the one who once played his television sister-in-law, said years later simply that she had loved him, that he was an incredibly gifted actor, and that she never truly understood just how troubled he really was underneath it all. His on-screen outlaw partner was once asked what he would say if he could somehow talk to Peter one more time. He imagined the conversation playing out endlessly in his mind, picturing himself asking Peter what on earth he had been thinking, and imagining Peter shrugging with that familiar mischievous grin, simply saying that he had messed up, and then adding the words that cut the deepest of anything in this entire story, that he wasn't even sure he wouldn't do the exact same thing again. If this story affected you in a way you weren't expecting, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another forgotten story that truly deserves to be remembered.